Okay, I suppose we'll get started. Thanks for bearing with us through the technical difficulties, but I think we have everything figured out and ready to go, so that's good. There's a Democratic debate happening tonight, in case you didn't know, but if you're here, you're probably not going to watch it. But I would argue that you've made the better choice, and I have a syllogism to support me in this too. First premise: God exists. I'm just going to start there. I know. If God exists and Ratio Christi is happening, then being at Ratio Christi is better than watching a political debate. Premise number 2. Ratio Christi is happening tonight. So by modus ponens, you made the better choice. So, thank you. Yeah, name the fallacy. Begging the question. Okay, so, yeah, like I said, welcome to Ratio Christi. I got some of the normal announcements that we usually do on Wednesday night, but if you want to keep up with what we do, and you aren't already, which I don't know why you wouldn't be, but if you aren't keeping up with what we do, sign up for the weekly email that Wesley writes every Monday that contains not just the topic, but resources, small little kind of whet your appetite things for what we're talking about on Wednesday nights, has all the different things about what's going on for dinner. We meet before here at 6 o'clock at the Union to eat and kind of talk and all of that. Join us for that. It contains all the stuff about our events as well, and our tabling times. Tabling times, we meet in the Union every Tuesday, 10:30, and every Wednesday, 11:15. Yes. So join us to table in the Union where we kind of set up a booth. Wesley just has a question. You can see it over on the whiteboard. He had 4 questions today for the tabling in the Union. 4 questions because those are the 4 questions that Frank Turek is going to address in his overview of why Christianity is true. Mm-hmm. That is less than a week away. On Tuesday of next week, we are having Frank Turek here. So that's before our Wednesday meeting. He's going to be talking about, does truth exist, does God exist, are miracles possible, and is the New Testament reliable? So basically all the semesters we've built up until now, that's what Frank's going to do. So a nice summary of everything we've done for the past 4 semesters, if you want that. Basic overview. I don't have enough space to be an atheist. Invite your friends. We got a seating capacity of 600 and 2 overflow rooms that we will get charged for if we don't use. So please invite your friends to use the overflow rooms. In addition to the Frank Turek event, then the next day we have a 400-year-old copy of the Torah on a scroll written in Hebrew here on display. It'll be in the Union from 10 to 4. And then it will also be here at our Wednesday night meeting next week. And Ben will give a presentation about the scroll, a little about its history, its significance, things like that. So we're looking forward to both of those things happening next week. So next week is a big week for Ratio Christi, some big events going on. Besides that, I can't think of anything else except for that we will be electing officers towards the beginning of April. So if you're interested in serving as an officer for Ratio Christi and helping us plan some of the logistics and figure out technology and do some of the things that you've seen some of us doing, let me know, because if you're a student at UNL, you can apply to become an officer, or if you just want to be a member so you can vote on the officers or vote on other odds and ends of business we have to conduct, there's that option as well. So talk to me if you're interested in those 2 things. And I think that's it for all the announcements. So now, without further ado, I'll bring up Wesley Farewell.
Yay! Thanks, Joel. I am very excited about the Frank Turek event. There's flyers on all of your tables. If you already have one, take the rest of them and give them out to people that you see anywhere. It's gonna be awesome. I'm really excited about it. Please come. So, our topic for the semester is the Bible true? And we're asking, who wrote it, where did it come from, and what's the evidence? Today, I will be addressing an objection. But before I get to that, I want to tell you that we are live streaming currently. So if you get out your telephones, get onto the internets, and go and like the video so that it shows up places. Go and share it so that it shows up places. That really helps us actually we've gotten a lot more business drummed up because we've been live streaming. So go on there now. Warning, if you go on there now, it will be noisy. And you'll be like, that was embarrassing. So be very careful when you go on there. The topics this semester, this is what has been being covered. I am down at number 9. Does the Bible borrow stories from ancient myths? That is the objection that I'm covering today. We're going to be talking about ancient myths, and if it looks like the Bible's been stolen any of those or used them as a source or something. So we'll get into the deep of that. So, objection. The Bible is just copied from ancient myths. There's something going on in my head. Hang on. Talk amongst yourselves awkwardly. Hang on.
I think it's interesting that some people think God exists, but miracles aren't possible.
From over there? Yeah.
By the math.
There's less no's
Yeah.
for God existing.
Unless somebody's being snarky and nothing he brings to them, maybe. I don't know.
That's possible.
We did it! Once again, for the probably 7th time tonight, Joel has saved the day. He came in and fixed my fonts. He came in and got my computer. Anyway, good job, Joel. Thank you for being the president. All right. So, has this ever happened to you? Somebody comes up and yells, "The Bible is just copied from ancient myths." And you standing there, befuddled, say, I don't know. Well, I want to give you some confidence so that you can say this question. Could you give me some examples? And then they say, the Epic of Gilgamesh contains a flood narrative that's older than the Bible, and the Jesus story is taken from ancient gods like Osiris, Horus, Mithras. Confusing. So today, we're going to go over the claims of the Epic of Gilgamesh, what the Epic of Gilgamesh actually says about the flood narrative, and go into that. We're going to go into the claims of the Horus, Osiris, and Mithras, 3 gods that it's popular to claim are the same as Jesus, or since these existed here, Jesus didn't exist, or Jesus is just a compilation of these gods kind of picked out and made for the Christian world. We're going to respond to these myths. I'm going to give you the responses to them that will be in different categories. We're going to dispel the underlying assumptions. We're going to deal with when someone says this objection, there are some assumptions being made, and we're going to call those out. Then I'm going to tell you the truth about the Epic of Gilgamesh, Osiris, Horus, and Mithras, and we're going to actually look at what history says. And then I'm going to close it out with some information about the Bible. Cool. So here is the Epic of Gilgamesh in the flood narrative. So that guy down there is Gilgamesh, and the tablet up there is one of the oldest ancient writings that we have, and on it contains a mention of the flood narrative about of what's going on. So Gilgamesh himself isn't the guy that we're talking about in his story. We're talking about something that's written on his tablet. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the similarity claims of the Bible, or of the flood narrative, are that there's a deity that wants to destroy the earth with a flood. A man is warned of the impending flood and told to build a vessel and to take some animals. The flood does destroy, and then after the flood, the protagonist sends out birds and sacrifices on a mountain. Sound familiar? It should. Those are the claims, just to kind of put those in your head. Now we're moving on. Osiris. Here are the claims made that Osiris is similar to Jesus. So the Epic of Gilgamesh is the Old Testament side of things, and then Osiris, Horus, and Mithras is the New Testament side of things, comparing to Jesus. Okay? Separate those. So these next three are comparing to Jesus. So these are the things that people claim about Osiris. That he's had all of these titles: King of Kings, Lord of Lords, the God who made women to be men and made men and women to be born again. His announcement was by 3 wise men and 3 stars. There was a star in the east signifying his birth. He had a Eucharist ceremony where people would eat communion of cakes and wheat. He taught a lot of the same material. Some of it's word for word. These are the claims, folks. And then he was killed and later resurrected, providing hope that every believer might be resurrected to eternal life. So that was Osiris. Horus. This one has a lot of popularization from the movie Religulous by Bill Maher. And these claims about these 3 gods and a few others are popularized by the movie Zeitgeist and largely due to Religulous by Bill Maher in his 2008 movie. But these are the claims of Horus, and there's a lot of them. Virgin mother named Mary, had a stepfather named Seb, or Joseph, born in a cave, heralded by a star, announced by an angel. There's a rite of passage at the age of 12, and then we don't have anything from 12 to 30. Sound familiar? Baptized in a river when he was 30, and his baptizer was later beheaded. Sounds like Jesus. There's 12 disciples. He performed miracles and exorcisms and walked on the water. Called Isa, the ever-becoming Son and the Holy Child. He delivered a sermon on the mount and was transfigured on a mount. Crucified between thieves, buried for 3 days in the tomb, and was resurrected. These are some pretty cool claims, right? Another one has a lot of things that he was called. Was a fisher, associated with a fish, the lion and the lamb. And he came to fulfill the law and reign. A lot of these things sound quite familiar, don't they? And that's the argument. This is Mithras, one more god. Mithras, born of a virgin on December 25th. Hey, in a cave attended by shepherds. That sounds familiar. Considered a great traveling teacher and master. 12 companions or disciples. Followers promised his followers immortality. He performed miracles, sacrificed for himself for world peace. Buried in the tomb, resurrected, later to become Easter. Known as the Good Shepherd. Once again associated with the Lion and the Lamb. Has a bunch more names. Savior and Messiah. And people celebrated on Sunday. And then believers celebrated the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper. So, that was a lot of information. Those were the claims. Remember, those were the claims of Epic of Gilgamesh, Horus, Osiris, and Mithras. Now I'm going to turn it over to you guys, and you're going to answer this question. If the Bible was copied from an ancient myth, what would or should that do to the Christian's faith? So if you yourself are a Christian, what would it do to your faith to find out that the Bible copy-pasted? And if you're not a Christian, what should it do to a Christian's faith? I'll give you a couple minutes.
Yeah, it seems like every like civilization that was near a floodplain has some sort of flood. Yeah. So this is something that happens.
All right. Fun stuff. There's some cool conversations going on, and I hope you at home had some good conversations too. So, let's check our outline, see where we are. We went over the claims of the Epic of Gilgamesh. We went over the claims of Osiris, Horus, and Mithras. And now we're going to move to our responses, kind of just a general overview of how we're going to respond. When I was working on this presentation, I was finding out that they all kind of landed in a certain category, and so I made different categories. Then we're going to look at underlying assumptions and see if those assumptions are valid or how much weight we can put on them. Then we'll talk about the truth behind what those claims are. Do some fact checking, do some digging, and then we'll talk about the Bible. So let's respond to the myths. So the first response when some of these claims are made is that they are just false. Just factually not true at all. When they say, hey, this guy did this thing, and you go back and look at the actual story, that's not true. It's not there. And there's not much else to say about it other than they just made it up. Like, I don't know where they got it. It's not there. So that's just one. That's a big one you'll see. The next one is I call it "That's a Stretch," because they take something that was about this God, and then they misword it enough to kind of match the story of Jesus. So there's two different ways this could happen. They could either do it that way, word it kind of confusingly so it matches Jesus. For example, Mithras was born from, they say Mithras was born of a virgin, right? When in reality, the story goes, that we have is that he was born out of a rock. And he kind of emerged from a rock. And so they say, born of a virgin, look. No. So that's, you're like, I guess you could say that, but why would you also? So similarity claim is that's a stretch. That's kind of a stretch. There's also another one, is that the claim they're making about this God doesn't fit or is misleading on the stuff we know about Jesus. So the example I have is born on December 25th. You're like, look, this guy's born on December 25th, so is Jesus. We're like, well, I mean, the December 25th thing has some reasons, but we don't say he was born on December 25th because, and that's why he's the God. It's misleading to kind of make that connection. The third one is called "What'd You Expect," where these attributes about this God is kind of a normal attribute about a God if you were to think of a God. If you were kind of making up one, or if you were imagining what a God come to earth would be, such as, the example I have here is, does miracles. You're like, yeah, you probably should do that. I mean, that's something normal about certain gods. If they were above humanity in some way, they were able to do fancy things. So that one's that category. And this one's a lot of fun. This one's backwards, where the information that we have about the God doesn't show up until after the time of Jesus. So it's more likely that rather than the Jesus story being copied from this God, it's more likely that they were copying from the Jesus story. So those are the four categories I saw: false, that's a stretch, what'd you expect, and backwards, and we'll see how those all play in when we get there. Now, we're going to look at some underlying assumptions that people make when they make these claims that get you rattled, because they won't get you rattled if you know what these assumptions are. So let's look at the first one. The first one is, because it's written earlier, that means the one written later copied from the earlier one. And that's sort of like a big push of these objections. When they say this flood narrative is written later than this flood narrative, that means this flood narrative is definitely a copy of this flood narrative. And that's just not necessarily true. I'm just trying to make you aware of these assumptions so that you're not caught off guard and gone, that's right. Look, I can see this one is later than that one. Don't let it worry you. My silly example is if I came up and told you a story and you wrote it down, and then I went and told him a story and then he wrote it down, that means that he copied from you because he wrote it down later than you wrote it down. Like, just not necessarily, right? So be aware of that. I forgot I had a graphic for this one. Mobby. It's slowly unraveling. Lovely. Should have had that up a long time ago. Next. Because this group came first, that means their version of what they're talking about, their concept of what they think is the right one. Similar to the other one, but slightly different because it's a group of people thinking a certain way. So the thing I'm thinking of is theological in nature, but I'll give another example. So years ago, the Earth was thought to be flat, and then later on, it was thought to be round. Then later on, it was thought to be heliocentric. So like, because this group is earlier, that means they're the right one. They came first. No, our thoughts of cosmology got better, but there's other examples that of like thoughts about revelation and stuff. So this is this example. Just because this group came first doesn't necessarily mean they are the right ones. So watch out for that assumption. This one's because I can draw a line from one thing to another, that means the thing I draw a line to is the false one. I mean, these are all sort of similar, but I have some really cool examples about this one. Ripped straight from somebody. So I'm quoting an article right here. I'll tell you. A man named Morgan Robertson once wrote about a British ocean liner that was approximately 800 feet long, weighed over 60,000 tons, and could carry about 3,000 passengers. The ship had a top cruising speed of 24 knots, 3 propellers, and about 20 lifeboats. The ocean liner hit an iceberg on its maiden voyage in the month of April, tearing an opening in the starboard side in the forward portion of the ship, and sank along with about 2,000 passengers. Do you know what ship that was? The ship spelled Titan. Correct. You probably think that's the Titanic. Well, no. Actually, that was the Titan, written in a book called The Wreck of the Titan, or Futility, published in 1898, which is 14 years before the Titanic sank. And what was it, 4 years? A few years before the construction actually began. So, there's an example of a fictional story and then a literal happening, but the fictional story sounds very similar to the actual event in history. So the underlying assumption is that you can draw is because these things have similarities and we know this is false, the Titanic must never have existed. That's not necessarily true. I have one more that's super cool. Prior to his election, he had been a boat captain, and he was related to a U.S. Senator, Attorney General, Ambassador to Great Britain, and the Mayor of Boston. He was elected to Congress in 47 and was a vice president runner-up in 56. He was elected president in 60. In his 30s, he was president, and his wife was a socially prominent 24-year-old girl at the time of their marriage. She spoke French fluently. While in the White House, his wife suffered a loss of a child. His family consisted of 3 children. As president, he was deeply involved in the civil rights of African Americans. He was assassinated and shot in the back of the head on the Friday before a major holiday, while seated beside his wife when she was not injured. On the day of his assassination, a staffer told him not to go to the event because he might be murdered, or where he was murdered. Following the assassination, there was claims that the fatal shot must have come from a different direction. His assassin was born in 1939 and was a Southerner who held extremist views. The assassin was murdered before he got to trial, and the killer was killed by a shooter who used a Colt revolver and fired only once. After the assassination, he was eventually succeeded by a vice president who was a Southern Democrat and former senator named Johnson. Who's that? Kennedy and Lincoln. So all of that information can be applied to both President Kennedy and President Lincoln. Now, what I did, does that mean that one of them didn't exist? No, not at all. Just because you can draw a line to something doesn't mean so this example is one person did exist and the other person also existed. A lot of times what you'll see is that these similarities are being cherry-picked. These little things are being like, okay, let's have this one and ignore this one. If you noticed, I said just the abbreviations of years. I never said 19 or 18. I just said the abbreviations, so you had to fill in the blanks. So a lot of times your brain just fills in the blanks, and you're like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Oh, yeah. So that's another main assumption that happens. The last little assumption, the last little thing that your brain wants to do, or that people who make this claim want you to do, is get into what I call conspiracy theorist mode, where they get in this like, that's what they want you to think. That's exactly what they want you to think. So try not to think it's a conspiracy theory. Like, yes, turn over the appropriate amount of rocks, but not everything is a conspiracy. So watch out, have some reasonable explanations. I'm not trying to dismiss or disparage critical thinking, but I do want you to be reasonable. So those are our underlying assumptions that we looked at, that happen a lot. These things come up and are prominent. So we have gone through these 4 things. The next things that we're going to happen is we're going to hit the truth about all four of these aspects: the flood narrative, and then Horus, Osiris, and Mithras. And then we're going to look at the Bible, and then have some Q&A time. Ready? Of course you are. You're very excited. Wesley, keep going. You got this. I was talking to myself. All right. One of the ancient, this is one of the oldest stories that we have, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Once again, here are my flood similarity claims. Now, the way that I'm going to address this is different than the way I'm going to address the other things. So you'll see. So here are other flood account similarities. I was listening in a little bit. I overheard some tables talking. There are a lot of ancient flood accounts. You'll see the percentages of the ancient flood accounts that we have that agree that there's a favored family. They were warned in advance. They saved some animals. What's interesting is 95% have a global catastrophic flood account, which is pretty cool. But these are accounts of a global flood. So my point with this is that the Epic of Gilgamesh flood narrative is not this like exciting thing that's never been around before. We have a lot of ancient accounts. Some of them do predate the Moses biblical account, and we shouldn't have to worry about that too much. We dispelled the because this one's older reason, and we'll get into it. So here is some information about our timeline. So since there's over 200 flood stories, a lot of them predating, we got to look at some dates just to see what happens. So Moses wrote the epic, or the flood story, between the 16th and 13th centuries BC. So there's some arguing about the times, but it's around there. The Epic of Gilgamesh was written between 1300 and 900 BC, but there's a section in there on the 11th tablet that references an Akkadian epic that was written a long time ago. So see what happened. As I understand it, Epic of Gilgamesh was written over here, but then it references this tablet over here that has a little bit of it, but this tablet has more information, which is why we're talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh and not the Akkadian epic. So that's what happened. And that's why they're like, this is older and whatnot. So, but this is older doesn't necessarily mean it's the right one. So that's the timeline, fun stuff. So it looks like the flood story is kind of older. Cool, good stuff. Well, let's look at a summary. If someone was to say, hey, let's summarize how the Epic of Gilgamesh flood narrative goes. And you said, hey, summarize that. I go, okay, well, the god Enlil decides to destroy the flood because people have become too noisy. Ea comes down and warns Utnapishtim that there's going to be a flood, and he says, hey, build a boat. And Utnapishtim does. He's ordered to take animals. The boat looks like a cube. The gods were afraid of the power of the flood. The flood came, and they were all like freaking out about how powerful it was. Utnapishtim releases birds to see if the ground is safe after he lands on a mountain. Enlil is upset that Utnapishtim and his family survived. He's mad that they survived. He wanted to destroy the world, remember? And Ea came down and warned him. And then Ea yells at Enlil to calm down. So those are some main attributes of the flood narrative found in the Gilgamesh epic. And yeah, you can see some similarities because it's a flood story. So something about that, or the Epic of Gilgamesh and Moses, is they're both writing about something that happened in the ancient past. So they're over here writing somewhere on this timeline that we see, but the event happened way back here. So none of them were witnesses, right? So we have to figure out, we have to ask the question, which one's more reliable? Both of these writers are in the same boat. My wife told me not to tell that joke. So we have to figure out which one's more reliable, why we should trust this narrative over this narrative, and so that's kind of where we're going to land. So why I think we should trust the biblical version over the Epic of Gilgamesh is that the Bible is more trustworthy more trustworthy than any other ancient document. And these are the reasons, and I'll go over these reasons later, but just to hit you with them. It contains specifics that have been corroborated elsewhere. It contains people and events that have been corroborated by archaeology. The transmission process is trustworthy. And when you compare the literary styles, the biblical narrative reads like history, and the Epic of Gilgamesh reads like myth. And you can argue with that, but I'm fine with that. But that's what we're doing. We're looking at the reliability of these two documents and seeing which one we should trust more because of where they are in history. So I'm going to turn it back over to you guys, so get ready to talk to your neighbors. Is it troublesome to you to know that there are so many ancient flood accounts? I just gave you that information that there's over 200 ancient flood accounts, but is that worrisome? Why or why not? You have to answer why or why not. I can't ask yes/no questions. I get in trouble.
widely known.
All right. Fun stuff. Okay. So, that was a fun time. That was the Epic of Gilgamesh, the truth. Going through what that is, talking about. We're going to move on to the three gods that we're going to compare Jesus to and talk about their claims, see if they're true, talk about the actual story of Osiris, Horus, and Mithras. Ready? Here is Osiris hanging out. Hey, man. So, claims of Osiris. First one that we looked at was that he had all these names that are similar to the ones that Jesus has. All right. He's called the King of Kings, Lord of Lords. So the answer to this is that it's false, and kind of what you expect. These are not names used by Osiris. He is called stuff, but it's not Lord of Lords, King of Kings. It's Lord of all, good being, Lord of the underworld, ruler of the dead, chief of the spirits. These are general names that are not uncommon for deities. So that's the first one. The second one is that he was announced by wise men, and that there's a star in the east, and that one's also false, and that's a stretch. It is true that some scholars connect Osiris with Orion, but they don't stretch it to call 3 stars of the belt 3 wise men. That's one of those, like, you have to kind of try really hard to get there. And there's no mention of an eastern star in the Osiris mythology. Next, the one that the Osiris has a Eucharist. There's no evidence for this at all in the research for Osiris. Fabricated. Simple. Next, Osiris taught much of the same material as Jesus, and many of the sayings are identical and word for word. Not at all. Nope. No evidence for this. The wisdom of Osiris is still available, and you can see it for yourself. Osiris was killed and resurrected, providing hope for every believer. That's kind of a stretch. It's kind of a not super the whole story. He was murdered, and his body was dismembered and scattered into 14 pieces, and his wife, Isis, wife/sister, found 13 of them and kind of put them back together. And then he journeyed to the underworld, and that's why he's the god of the dead. But he was a dead god, and he never returned to the living. So that is Osiris. These are, if you're keeping score at home, this is the score sheet. Claim 1 is that's a stretch, and what'd you expect? That's the breakdown. You'll see this at each one. So let's look at the main point summary. So you said, hey, Wesley, tell me about Osiris. Oh, you got it. He's one of the most popular of the Egyptian gods. He's god of the underworld and grain. His siblings with and married Isis, his sister. Set, his brother, is his nemesis. Set kills him, chops him into 14 pieces. Isis gathers him, and in one story, buries him in a bunch of different spots, buries the pieces where they find him. That's why there's lots of graves. Or 2, put him back together, and he revived, and she made Osiris, or Horus, with Osiris's dead body. And now he's ruling in the underworld. So that's Osiris, if you wanted to learn about him. He's an important player in mummification, which is another one of those, like, beyond the grave type of ideas. Moving on to Horus. Yes, sir. You may ask a question.
I'm not sure if I'm going to repeat it here, but if you were to actually go and read the Osiris stories, they are actually super weird.
Yes, I agree. There's some things that I left out intentionally for the kids at home, because it's kind of gross, and we'll get into it with Horus a little bit, but yes. So Horus, let's look at his examples. So the first thing we said about Horus was that he was, I don't need that one, conceived by a virgin mother named Mary and had a stepfather named Seb, also known as Joseph. Well, if that was true, that would be very similar. But actually, no, it's not true at all. He was not conceived by a virgin. He is Osiris' son, Osiris and Isis. And she wasn't a virgin when she made him. She made him with Osiris. So normal way that gods would do that. There's no evidence about Seb doesn't mean Joseph. That's just not a thing. So they're like, oh, stepfather. Also, Seb is like Osiris's dad, so that would be his grandfather. So just these are just false claims, not true. Born in a cave, birth announced by an angel, heralded by a star. False. There's no reference to a cave or manger in the Egyptian story of Horus. None of these details are present in that story. Horus was born in a swamp, and his birth was not heralded by an angel, and there was no star. So just another one of these, just like not there. You're making up stuff to try to make it claim not true. Attended a special rite when he was 12, and there's no information about him between 12 and 30. There's no continuous effort in the Horus mythology to account for these years. There are also no real gaps in the chronology. So Horus never taught at a temple when he was 12, as Jesus did. So that's just false. Baptized in a river at 30, and his baptizer was beheaded. Horus was actually never baptized. False. They point to Anup, the baptizer. Conspiracy theorists do, these people that make these claims, claiming he was later beheaded, but there was no such person in the Horus story. He had 12 disciples. No, he had 4 disciples, and there was reference to 16 followers. Yes, 16 minus 4 is 12, but that's not how they do things with numbers. He performed miracles and exorcisms and walked on water and raised people from the dead. Well, yes, he performed miracles. We were describing a god, but there's no mention of exorcising demons or raising people from the dead or walking on water. So, no. Called Isa, the ever-becoming son, and the holy child. No one in Egyptian history was ever called Iusa. Don't know how to pronounce that. The word does not exist, nor was anyone called the holy child. See, some of these are just boring. They're like, no. I'm sorry, I don't know where you're getting that. That's just false. Delivered a Sermon on the Mount and was transfigured. Still, once again, not happening. Didn't happen at all. Just false. Crucified between 2 thieves and buried for 3 days in a tomb and was resurrected. It wasn't reported that Horus had died. There's no crucifixion story. He dies and is reborn, I guess, every day when the sun rises, kind of like Ra. I think, but that's kind of a later thing with the sun rising. But that would be a stretch. There's a parallel account describing Horus's death, how pieces were cast into the water, later fished out by a crocodile, but not at all anything like resurrecting. A bunch of names called the Way, the Light, the Good Shepherd. None of these are titles in the Egyptian stories for any god in mythology. Great God, Chief of Powers, Master of Heaven. But Horus was not called the Christ. This word in Egyptian means burial, so it wasn't a title at all. Almost done. Was called the Fisher. They're associated with the fish, the lamb, and the lion. Not particularly. He was associated, some of them think he was associated with a fish, but there's no evidence that he was ever called the fisher or was associated with a lion or a lamb. So, once again, these things are just kind of thrown out there for you to get shaken in your boots. But dig into it, and you'll find out it's false. Came to fulfill the law. There was no Egyptian law for Horus to fulfill, and there's not a mention of 1,000 years in Egyptian mythology. So here's your scorecard. Lots of false over there. 2 of those guys and 1 of those. This one's a lot of just made up stuff. So all those claims that we had at the beginning, just throw them out the window. Horus's story. Hey Wesley, tell me about Horus. You got it. He was the son of Isis and Osiris, conceived miraculously by Isis with Osiris after Osiris died. He's kind of got a sun god kind of feel, great sky god. Defeats his father's brother, his uncle, Set, often depicted with the head of a falcon, and he's the spiritual force behind the pharaohs. That's kind of his job, and he represents kingship. So those are the things I would say about Horus. And so if you want to try to put Jesus in there, there's very few things that you could kind of be like, well, I guess that one. Yeah. Mithras. Ready? This one has 11. Let's get going. Born of a virgin on December 25th in a cave. That's a stretch and kind of backwards. He was actually born out of solid rock. So not born of a virgin, unless you consider being born out of a rock being born of a virgin. His birthday was celebrated on December 25th, but the first Christians knew that wasn't the true date of Christ's birth anyway. And there's some reasons why we put it on December 25th, but that's not part of like the Jesus narrative when they put it out there. Shepherds are part of the Mithraism, witnessing his birth and helping Mithras emerge from the rock. But interestingly, the shepherds exist in the birth chronology at a time when humans are not supposed to have been born yet. So like there's some trouble with that whole scene anyway. Coupled with the fact that the earliest versions of that emerged 100 years after the New Testament, so it's likely that they borrowed. So this is one of those backwards ones where this stuff happened later. Considered great traveler and teacher. Nothing in the tradition indicates that he was a teacher of any kind, and also this would be expected if of any deity walking among us. It's a usual draw for what gods are called. Had 12 companions or disciples. There's no evidence of this in the traditions from Iran or Rome. It's possible the idea of Mithras had 12 disciples is derived from murals where he's surrounded by 12 persons of the zodiac, some of them the moon and the sun and stuff. But even this post-dates Christianity. So once again, who's borrowing from whom? Mithras promised his followers immortality. Little evidence for this. It's certainly reasonable to think Mithras might have offered immortality, but it's not uncommon for any god of mythology. So kind of what you expect on that one. Performed miracles. Another kind of what you expect about that one. There's little or no evidence, but the story about Mithras slaying a bull is a heroic deed, but that's kind of as close as it gets. So like this bull represented a miracle. Yeah. Sacrificed himself for world peace. Sort of. The bull being slaughtered represented a shift in some things and turned us toward reconciliation. Not fully a full parallel. You have to kind of stretch to get that one. Buried in a tomb, rose again, celebrated the time of Easter. There's nothing in the Mithraic tradition indicating that he ever even died, let alone resurrected. Tertullian wrote about Mithric believers reenacting resurrection scenes, but he wrote about this occurring after the New Testament times, backwards. Called the Good Shepherd. There's no evidence that Mithras was ever called the Good Shepherd or identified with the lamb, but since he was a sun god, he was associated with Leo. This also still post-dated Christianity. So once again, probably more likely that this story is borrowing from the Christian perspective. Considered to be the way, the truth, the life. That's kind of a stretch. Research shows that it was known to be a historic record of these Mithric traditions, but none of these terms ever applied to Mithras, except for mediator. So sort of in there. Mithras was not the mediator between God and man, but the mediator between all good and evil gods of Zoroaster. So the mediator between the gods of good and evil in that tradition. His believers celebrated on Sunday. This tradition, celebrating Sunday, is only true of Mithraic believers in Rome, and it postdates Christianity. His believers celebrated the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper. Followers did not celebrate a Eucharist. They did celebrate a fellowship meal, but that's kind of what you'd expect. Whew! We did it. Here's your scorecard. All of these claims checked. This one had a lot more backwards things in it. All right, now, what is the deal with Mithras? Let me tell you. Well, he emerged from a rock. He slayed a bull. That's like the main thing. If you can see that picture up there, he's slaying a bull. When you type in Mithras, he's slaying a bull. That's the thing he did. So it's associated with the moon and fertility. He's like looking at the moon, and some other animals are like taking stuff from the bull. It's weird, but associated with the sunrise, which I saw that it's you mutter something about Mithras when you do the sun salutation in yoga, if you are on that side of the yoga side. And then he never died. So these are some fun things about Mithras. All right. Now, why do we trust the Bible more than other documents about chronicling history, chronicling events that happened? While Adam will probably get into this with his objection about the Bible has contradictions or mistakes, I'm going to give just a short section about why. I'm going to throw a lot of information up there so that you can kind of be befuddled and say, whoa, that's a lot, just so that you know it's there, so that we have confidence, and then we will take some Q&A. So, the Bible, this is our slide from before. It's more trustworthy because it contains specific details that are corroborated elsewhere. People and events are corroborated by archaeology, and its transmission process is trustworthy and timely. So let's look at the first one. Contains specific details that have been corroborated elsewhere. These are just some examples of places in the Bible that have been referenced by extra-biblical sources. The extra-biblical sources are in there, and you can, and if you'd like later, I can show you where we can find these. But these are the things that talk about that are kind of pointing to the Bible and saying or saying that this event happened here, and this event, they're talking about the fall of Samaria in another place. So these things are corroborated by other extra-biblical sources. So it's not just a document that's pulled out of a hat or made up. Contains people and events that have been corroborated by archaeology. These names and events have archaeological evidence to support them. So that's another reason why we can trust the Bible, because that there's constant archaeological evidence and archaeological facts that are coming forth and saying, hey, this mentions King David, or this mentions Belshazzar from the King David thing that we saw in Daniel. So the claims of Judaism and Christianity are more than just proverbial insights. They're claims about the historic past that can be verified or falsified. That's that one. And the last one is the transmission process. And this just has a lot of information on how scribes scribed. So lots and lots of just like specific processes they went through. So when somebody... Here's another objection. Oh, it's just the telephone game. I've heard that one a bunch. Scribes had a process, guys. It wasn't... Sometimes they do have mistakes that you can blatantly see, but there are things in place to keep these documents from going off in one too giant of a direction. And this discipline is so rich that you can dive deep and deep and deep into it, and you can get multiple degrees and still not know all the things to know about textual criticism and documents preservation. When manufacturers are concerned about the quality and consistency, they implement standardized production procedures to ensure the quality of each product. If you want a reliable product, you got to establish a reliable process. In a similar way, these ancient scribes established important safeguards as a part of a painstaking process to ensure an accurate transmission of the text. And if you read a few of those, they're like very specific tiny things of like, oh, if they noticed that, they made a mark and made sure that the people knew about it. It's all very specific. So this is just one more reason why the Bible is more trustworthy. Last thing I'll say, go to the Frank Turek event. There's flyers on there. Okay. When? Tuesday the 25th at 8 p.m. So, I would love to take some questions. Please raise your hand. I will not take questions if you don't raise your hand. Yes, sir, in the back.
So you've been talking about the facts involved in these claims, but when someone comes up to me and says, hey, I was reading a Reddit post yesterday about how Horus was actually this, and I'm like, yeah, that's just not true. Doesn't that kind of just lead to a closed down conversation?
Yeah.
Because no one that's going to come up to talk to me has actually researched Horus with any real fervor.
Sure.
And even if they have, I'm not equipped to combat them
Right.
on their level.
Yeah.
So how can I take this information and engender goodwill in a conversation as opposed
Yeah.
to shutting them down?
That's a good question. How to do this tactfully when someone brings this, hey, Horus had 12 disciples, just like Jesus. Yeah, well, I wouldn't, well, that's just false. You'd have to know that first, but that would be very harsh. But yeah, the way I would do it is I'd say, wow, that's, I would say let's study it together. Let's look at the actual things. Because I heard at a Ratio Christi lecture by someone who's super cool that a lot of these claims are either just patently false, like made up, or they are stretched to be sort of similar and name all the things, which I would say if you're trying to get into it. But if they're just coming up and saying, hey, Horus did this, I mean, you'd have to be like, okay. Or you can say, buh, like we did before. I'd go with saying, how do you know that? How'd you come to that conclusion? Question number 2 in our tactics book, which everyone's read. Does that answer your question? Just tactfully, not being a jerk and just saying, let's look at the evidence itself, because that's what we're doing. I'm trying to as well. If I'm wrong, please let me know.
I was just.
Yes, you, sir, in the back.
I was just going to add to that, so I'm not asking questions. So
Oh.
I just raise my hand.
That is a good point.
Yeah, I would just add to that, like, in that moment, saying, oh, that's interesting. How did you come to that conclusion? Like he mentioned, how did you come to that conclusion? Or what do you mean by resurrection? If they bring up Osiris, right, that was more of a revivification. He was more revived by a different God and not entirely restored in the same way that he existed prior to. The claim of Christianity is that Christ rose again in the exact same way, though glorified.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't missing parts, as Osiris actually was. So how did you come to that conclusion? What do you mean by that? Are just some really good questions to engage in that conversation and not have to know anything. Like if someone says, I was reading on this Reddit page, say, oh, that's interesting, what do you mean by? And all of a sudden, they're either going to back down or you're going to have an opportunity to actually have a conversation with them.
Mm-hmm.
So, and if you do remember some of this information, then you can always kind of follow up that conversation with, well, have you ever considered that Osiris wasn't actually resurrected? He was revived by a different god. And
Is that as similar as you're trying to make it?
Yeah. So So just a couple ways. Remember that you don't always have to know everything, and it's okay to say, "That's interesting. I haven't considered that. I'll get."
I don't know.
That's
I don't know is a good
fantastic
answer.
response.
Yes, you behind the camera.
So, are a lot of these arguments like popular level, or are there more like scholarly sources than?
Yeah, I'll speak to that. They are most definitely on the popular level. And I was going to get some quotes by some guys commenting on a Richard Dawkins page, but I decided not to. But they were excited about this tactic. If that's why I asked the question: if the Bible was copied by ancient myths, what would that do to Christianity? And this gentleman was like, "That would be a devastating claim." And I agree. There'd be a lot of things to deal with. But then he looked into it, like, sincerely. He got all this information from a religious, he admits, and then he's like, I'm going to look into that so that I can, punch my Christian friends with this argument. He looked into it and found that these similarities aren't actually that similar. He found what we found, like, not really. I mean, and also there's not really evidence that they move these. And so when they look into it, and other people were telling this gentleman who was trying to find the answer, they were like, yeah, when you start looking into it, there's not much into it, and there's not much there. So I wouldn't use that one, is what they're saying. So as far as it being popular or scholarly, definitely on the popular level of sides, not the scholarly level. Yes, you in the back.
So Wesley, what sources mostly did you use when you were putting together your, aside from scripture, what were you looking at? Can you share with us like some of the things that you were using to go back and,
Yeah. On my weekly email, which you all get, I put some scholarly sources that I used, and some kind of just places to start, like Joel says, some kind of things to get you interested. But I also, since I was doing the work this week, I put some sources on there. I think I used ancient.eu as just a scholarly site, and put in the Horus, Osiris, and Mithras
so most
pages.
of what you talked about tonight, we could go back to the email and
Yeah.
go
I also
deeper on this.
I also used this came from a well-known apologist from his site. He does a lot of articles. J. Warner Wallace, one of my favorites. So I used him a lot, and then used his sources as well. And that's what you do on the internet. You find, you go to Wikipedia and then go down to the bottom where they cited things, and then go find that. But I tried as hard as I could not to find these biased things that are like nonsense. Because I'm being fair, if there are some similarities that one of those gods had that was like, hey, that sounds kind of like Jesus, the guy who's the kingship represents kingship. Jesus represents kingship. That sounds right. But all of these things are too much of a stretch to actually be real. So J. Warner Wallace is what I used. Ancient.eu, because I didn't want to get a prescription with Britannica. And I think that was all. There was some other places in there, and I can show you where to find those if you'd like. Anything else? Yes, you in the back.
So, this method you're talking about for copying the Bible
Yeah.
was primarily popularized by the Masoretes from roughly the 6th century to the 10th century after Christ.
Okay.
Do you have sources for looking at where things go before that?
Prior to that?
How that's done?
I don't, but that's a good point. I don't have sources on that one, but I do know that this is a very involved discipline, and the people that talk about the ancient texts and how this source text is we know it's from this one because this has this mistake, and these two are the ones that have the mistake from this line, and this line has here. And we don't have these copies, but we do have the copy of this one, so we know what this one back here says. Like, it gets really, really involved, and they have all these numbers. Ben a couple weeks ago was talking about P52, and it gets nuts. But as far as how they did it, we also can see like mistakes that they make, and notice that they're mistakes they make. One of them, and know that it's an obvious mistake and somebody wasn't paying attention like at all, where instead of copying something down the correct way, he copied like across the paragraphs. So imagine copying this slide and saying, when copies of the scripture started to wear, they were quickly if a word was identified as incorrect. They did that type of thing. You're like, that's just completely wrong. That's not, and they put it in the wrong order. Like these, some of the errors that that we see are obvious to notice. But it gets deep down, and that's why we can say we have this many copies, and we can get back to the originals within a. Do you remember the number, Ben? 90.
P52 is a fragment from the book of John. It's dated to roughly 120 AD to 150 AD, which is what, 60. Yeah, about 60 to 80 years, 60 to 90 years
After the fact, yeah.
after Jesus died, which is significantly earlier than any of the other writings that we have about, say, Julius Caesar, which are 200, 300, 400 years after he actually.
Right. But to your question of do we have any of the processes before this, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Good question.
I will be getting into some of that, or along those lines next week, when we have the scroll here.
We are having a scroll here next week.
Yes, so some of the stuff is well be going over as well.
Come for the scroll. It'll be displayed. Come for the scroll next week, but first, the day before that, go to the Frank Jurek event. It's Tuesday night.
So the scroll's not gonna be here next Wednesday night.
The scroll will be here next Wednesday night.
It's here and also in the
So
meeting.
we're going to be displaying it in the Union Wednesday,
In the Union on Wednesday
and
from 10 to 4.
we won't. I'm not exactly sure how much space we'll have, but you'll want to come. Don't just stop by in the Union, because we've got this entire room's length, and the scroll itself is 79 feet long.
Yeah.
So we will try to have as much of it rolled out as possible here, and actually have some of the portions of Numbers or Deuteronomy actually identified.
Torah scroll here next week. So show up. And we might take the camera and show you the scroll. So that'd be pretty cool. All right. Awesome. Hey, well, thanks guys for coming and for asking some questions and for listening to the objection that we had. So next time you don't have to say buh. Have a good night.